Hello, everyone. I'm Jim Garrison. I want to welcome you to this session of Humanity Rising as we convene day 3 of a 5-day program on technologies of hope. Today, I want to begin with something that has dominated the news cycle over the last 24, 36 hours, because I think it's very important as we contemplate technology generally to take in how it's being used. And I'm referencing the blowing up of the Kakhovka Dam in Ukraine along the Dnieper River. You've all seen the reports. Thousands and thousands of people have been displaced. Entire villages have been inundated and are underwater. The damage is very, very extensive. And it's the use of technology in war, using environmental factors to inflict damage to the enemy. There's a couple points that I want to make about this because I think it's very important for all of us to understand some of the deeper realities that are taking place. The first is that the news is filled with the assertion that this is the Russians. There's no proof, but it's probably the Russians, and this is emanated from the White House. All the major news media have been echoing the same line. And I want to just begin by saying that the deeper truth is that this was an attack orchestrated by the United States and the Ukrainians as part of the counteroffensive that Anthony Blinken and Victoria Nuland and others have been heralding for some weeks now, saying that the Ukrainians were going to be launching a massive coordinated attack against the Russians. And the Kakhovka Dam is just the most recent episode in that counteroffensive. Some things that are very important to note. One is that this is not the first time that the dam has been attacked. The Ukrainians have been trying to damage the dam for much of 2023. In fact, last December, one of the Ukrainian generals said that the destruction of the dam was one of the strategic goals of the Ukrainian military. And the reason is very simple. When the dam broke, much of the flooding was south of the Dnieper, where the Russians have built a sort of a heavily fortified, mine-laced defensive infrastructure. And that's all now been flooded. More importantly, that reservoir provides most of the water for Crimea. So the damage done to the dam is going to deprive the population in Crimea of water very, very quickly. So this has been a strategic goal of the Ukrainians for some time. And the reason why I wanted to raise it today is so that at least the people in the Humanity Rising global community can be aware that there's not only another reality going on that you're not hearing about in the mainstream news, but more fundamentally, this is going to now be a pretext for a further escalation. And the reason why that's important is because the Russians have made it crystal clear that they will use nuclear weapons to defend what they've taken. And so the danger that is now being fomented largely by the United States and Ukraine as they continue to escalate with more and more sophisticated weaponry, with all kinds of attacks, drone attacks against the Kremlin and Russian populations inside Russia, is leading us inexorably closer to a nuclear exchange. And the world, as I've said a number of times, has not been in this level of danger since the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962. If we'd have gone to nuclear war, as we almost did, most of Europe, Russia, and North America would still be a radioactive wasteland. And here we are 60 years later in Ukraine, escalating a conflict, a needless, pointless conflict to increasingly dangerous levels. And we need to be aware that the Ukrainian situation is the most dangerous trouble spot in the world today. And the fact that almost everybody, 80, 90% of the US population and the NATO populations are cheering the war and believing the news that is coming out 24/7, 365 about Ukraine is deeply, deeply troubling. And we need to be aware of some of the deeper layers of what is going on so that we stay vigilant. We do not need a counteroffensive in Ukraine. What we need is a ceasefire. And that's what Kennedy and Khrushchev did in 1962. They solved the conflict diplomatically. And Anthony Blinken, just 3 days ago in Helsinki, welcoming Finland into NATO, said that a ceasefire is off the table and that they're going to continue to escalate this conflict until they have defeated the Russians. So what you have is the irresistible force of US military sophistication and expansionism, bringing NATO into Eastern Europe against the immovable object of Russian nationalism and an explicit, publicly stated assertion that nuclear weapons will be used if the Russian forces begin to be overwhelmed. So we all need to take this in so that as we talk about technology today, and we're going to talk about positive uses of technology, which are really important. We need, as I've urged us over the last 3 days, to understand the deep wisdom of the indigenous peoples and the Aboriginals, particularly from Australia, who go back over 100,000 years, that technology is inherently combustible. When we deal with technology, we're playing with fire. It is not neutral. It is something that animates and activates the hubris of the human soul. And it's our lack of appreciation of that and our willingness to just absorb the storyline of the mass media that is leading us inexorably to a use of technology, nuclear weapons technology, that will do unimaginable damage to our world. And so as we watch this unfolding counter-offensive, all of us should be doing everything we can at every level of governance to call for a ceasefire. Because if we do not, we will regret it at levels that we can't even imagine. I understand this is a little sobering, but the news is very, very sobering and very, very troubling because it's going to be used as a justification for another escalation that's going to bring us closer to a nuclear exchange. So just like in 1962, it's very important that people be aware and that they speak out. Thank you, everyone. Let us, against this backdrop, do the simplest thing in the world, and let us just breathe together. And let us pray that we have the collective awareness and fortitude of spirit to ferret the distinction between the wheat and the chaff and do what needs to be done to secure the human future. Because we are in a world of multiple code reds, and it is not altogether clear how it's all going to turn out. And therefore, each and every one of us has to take an enhanced responsibility for not only speaking truth to power, but using whatever power we do have for collective enlightenment. In a moment, you'll hear the sound of a bell. When you hear the bell, just breathe in very slowly, and you'll hear then another bell and breathe out. We're going to take 10 breaths together, and then we will begin our program. Thank you, everyone. Welcome to Humanity Rising. Thank you, everyone. So good to breathe together with all of you while we handle some of these issues that are confronting us day by day in our current reality. And yet through it all, Humanity Rising is trying to find those 1,000 points of light, those people that are working tirelessly on various solutions across the whole range of Code Red issues and issues beyond Code Red. Where are people generating the vitality that we need to ensure human survival? This week is on technology. So I'd like to welcome someone that I've just met, Russ Dondo, who will be convening our program along with George Caponelli and Tom Eddington, that everyone knows very well. So I see all three of you on the screen. I'll turn it over to Russ first, and then George or Tom, whatever comments you would like to make.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks, Jim. I want to introduce Chris Maurer. I'm really happy to have him here. We have an architect who is not only innovative in his normal commercial and residential designs, but he's innovative in a way that you wouldn't even expect from an architect. So let me introduce him. He's an architect, an innovator, and a founder of Red House Studio in Cleveland, Ohio. Chris has worked in North America, Europe, Africa and has led projects for such clients as the Clinton Global Initiative, the UN Millennium Project, Madonna's Raising Malawi, and NASA's NIAC program. Red House is also working with MIT's Center for Bits and Atoms and the Standard Bank Group to develop materials and processes in Namibia from biomass waste that can create food, save water, and sequester carbon. In Cleveland, Red House is using living organisms to remediate and recycle waste construction and demolition materials with their Biocyler technology. With a renowned astrobiologist named Dr. Lynn Rothschild at the NASA Ames Research Center, Red House is designing self-growing habitats for off-planet missions. Chris has also written open source building technology manuals on earth construction and biomaterial production for the AIA, the Center for Architecture Foundation, and for Elsevier. So, George, Tom, before Chris gets started, did you have anything that you wanted to add on any of this?
Actually, I have a lot to add, but I think it'll take us off track. So
Okay.
I just want to share with our audience that Jim has been articulate over these 3 days in talking about the fact that the indigenous, especially in Australia, talk about and turn away from the use of fire because they believe that that launches the whole initiative. I think about that warning that we give to each other, especially to our children, about not playing with fire. And the challenge for me as I look around the world today is that we have too many oversized children with undersized emotions, spiritual and physical development, who are currently playing with fire. And those people, unfortunately, exist on both sides of this dilemma that we are facing in the world. So having people like Chris and Michael Sussman, who will meet later, and the folks that have been on Monday and Tuesday is a delight. Peter Drucker, many of you know, world-class management guru, often used to say to his clients and to the world at large, if you want to know the future, invent it. And what we're seeing in people like Chris, and I'm delighted to have you with us and delighted to learn more about your work, is someone who is in fact helping to invent a future that's far more sustainable, intelligent, and sane than the future that we find ourselves in. So I invite our audience to pay close attention, and Chris, I'm delighted to have you with me.
Yeah, thank you, Russ. Thank you, George, and thank you, Jim. You know, as we are exploring this week on technologies of hope, we've been so indoctrinated that technology comes out of Silicon Valley and it's software-based. And our mindset, when we think about technology, we forget technology like communication, the ability to speak. We forget about other kinds of technologies, about how to effectively bring people together. And so delighted to have Michael Sussman with us today. Michael began his career in transportation in 1994 by launching Strategic Rail Finance, advising government and businesses on strategies to improve capital investment, freight infrastructure, and industrial systems. His common sense message based in whole systems thinking resonates across political and geographic spectrums. In 2007, Michael founded On Track North America, an NGO dedicated to sustainable supply chain planning. And part of the technology that Michael's going to be sharing with us today is how to get various stakeholders to effectively collaborate and work together. So welcome, Michael. Thanks for joining us, and turn it back over to you, Chris.
Okay, well, thank you all. It's a pleasure to be here today. I'm going to be talking briefly about the concept of biomaterials. And as it relates to this conversation today, I think, we draw a lot of inspiration from indigenous knowledge. And we kind of look at architecture as having mostly separated from nature a very long time ago. And some of the technology that we're trying to promote is actually a return to the ways of building that were more in line with indigenous beliefs and more in line with nature itself. So I'm going to share some slides. I'm an architect, so I can't really talk without pictures behind me. So I'll just go ahead and share this. And hopefully that's coming through. And as I mentioned, I'm going to talk about biomaterials, and I want to define that firstly and say that these are materials that utilize the growth of organisms in their manufacture. So we're all familiar with bio-based materials. That's things like wood and bamboo and even fabrics like cotton. These were plants and other organisms that were grown and then harvested and then processed into something new. When I'm talking about biomaterials, I'm talking about actually growing things into things. So the manufacture itself relies on the growth of the organism. And there's a few kingdoms that we can look at that are really good at this. They're usually microbial in nature because microbial life tends to grow very fast and is much more easy to manipulate. There are, folks that can grow, fruits into different shapes and to grow even, trees and different large scale plants into different shapes by curating them over, weeks, months, years, decades even. But the thing about microbial life is it grows so fast, you can actually use that to manufacture something fairly quickly. And the first kingdom we can look at is plant. And that's, in the form of algae. There are plenty of companies that are looking at making plastic alternatives out of algae that are biodegradable, carbon absorbing in their manufacture. And algae can actually span a couple kingdoms, so that there are cyanobacteria algae so that's another kingdom that we can look at as bacteria. But mostly when I'm talking about bacteria, there's a process called calcite, microbial induced calcite precipitation, and that's when bacteria actually form cementitious material. So you can make things out of the cement that they produce. So it's a byproduct of the growth of the bacteria, but it can be grown in situ to actually create those products. Kingdom fungi, that's my favorite, mostly for the dad jokes. I am a fun guy, and I'll talk about, throw those in there from time to time, but it's also one that we're very steeped in working with and have a lot of experience with. So I'll talk mostly about that today. And then if we combine some of these kingdoms, we can have symbiotic relationships between them. And we're doing that with some of our work that we're doing with NASA that I'll talk about as well. Here are a few practical examples. As I mentioned, the algae can be converted into plastic-like materials. There's a company called Biomason that you see secondarily there that's using bacteria to make these bricks. Fungi is being used, not only looking into building materials and manufacturing materials, but textiles. This is a designed by Stella McCarthy, Paul McCartney's daughter, Stella McCartney, who does work with textiles made from fungi. They're leather-like replacements. And then the symbiotes, we'll talk again about some of the stuff that we're doing, proposing off-planet with NASA. These are some products that are commercially available at this point, or nearly commercially available, I should say. Ecovative is one of the pioneers that is creating packaging materials, and they sub-license their technology to folks like Biome and Loop and Bolt Threads and others to actually convert those into usable goods. Myco Works is on the bottom right there. they're producing faux leather materials that are being used in varieties of applications, including, I believe, work with Hermès. And the top right there is a block that we're making in Namibia, as Russ mentioned in the intro, that we're working with folks in Africa to actually take encroacher bush and convert that into food and building materials and store carbon at the same time. And I'll talk about that as we go along. So I'm an architect again, so we're going to talk mostly about architecture, and these are probably the forerunners of the concept of mycotexture. So that's using fungal mycelium to create buildings or built environments, or anything in the built environment, built structures. And these were temporary installations that were done by some artists and architects that actually use, in the case of the one on the right, living mycelium, that was actually fruiting mushrooms to create a arch structure. And then on the left there, you see a sculpture that was made by David Benjamin and Ecovative at MoMA's PS1 in New York City as an installation, a summer installation, that was part of the mandate was that the materials should be mostly or almost all fully biodegradable. And so that's one of the reasons that this project was so effective in that case.
Hey, Chris, Russ, can I ask you a quick question about that? So, you're looking at those structures.
Mhm.
Are they going to last, or are they going to rot? Since it's
Absolutely not. No, these are these are temporary installations, and so I just mentioned these as the forebearers for what we could see as a durable building. So these structures could last forever if you were to protect them. If it stayed in that gallery forever, it would last forever. But if it was exposed to the elements, that would be very problematic. So it comes down to building technology. Neither one of these are load bearing as well. So they're mostly just sculptural examples of what is possible. When we get into the processes that Red House and MycoHab and Biocyler are working with, then you'll start to see that there are applications that could be load bearing, could be structural, insulative, fire resistant, all of these multifunctional facets at the same time. And it really comes down to the building technology detailing that would protect those structures indefinitely. The same way the wood breaks down over time. If you just had a 2x4 framed house that had no siding on it, that wouldn't last indefinitely either. But if you cover that with brick or what have you, it could last potentially centuries.
Thank you.
So the first, I'm going to start far away and I'm going to come back here to Cleveland where I am. The first one we're going to talk about is our work with NASA. This is, space architecture is the concept of actually being able to grow things off planet. One of the main reasons for doing this is the cost of transport of material to destination. So that, it's a huge cost to NASA and other spacefaring organizations to have to transport building materials. So the trade-off they make is you can either be like the turtle and take it with you, which buys reliability but costs you energy and in this case money, or you could be like the bird and have enough faith in your own ability to build once you get to destination, that you could just build with what you find on the moon or Mars or wherever you're going. In most cases, that's going to be regolith, which is soil. Their version of soil, and trace atmospheric elements, and possibly in the case of at least the moon and Mars, there should be water available for construction. So what we propose is something in the middle of those, where you take a small collapsed bag that could then expand into a larger form, and then you add most of the mass of the building once you get there. So if you look on the left, you'll see the mass meter. We've transported something that's now 10 tons, so not exactly light, but compared to the size of the building, it ends up being a very light lift. Now you see the rover is pumping in situ sourced water into the structure, which is growing a algal substrate. So this is where this becomes symbiotic, because the plants actually have to be grown there. We can find no biomass to actually use for growing mycelium. So we have to grow the plants. The plant turns into this fibrous material that then we can use mycelium to create a dense composite of it. So, you'll see in some of the other examples that I give you, and if you can see on the screen, here's an example of a mycocomposite. So it's, something that was made from plant fibers and mycelium grown together. And it sounds like wood, it looks like wood, it smells like wood. It's basically, taking the best of two kingdoms here. So we have plant and fungi together, creating a very strong composite material. And it'll have other bioperformative aspects to it that I'll start to talk about here. So when it comes to structural ability and things like that, it's very comparable to any of the other what they call ISRU materials, which are in situ resource utilization materials. These are materials that are basically made from stuff you can find at destination. So you can compress regolith, you can actually melt regolith, you can 3D print with lava. All of these things, are very creative ways of turning the soil there into something useful. There was one research team that actually proposed, hey, we can build with water. It's very cold there, so why don't we just make an igloo? And the concept is to actually have a structure made out of ice that works on a lot of levels, because the ice is then a really good shield from radiation. We can, kind of compete along all of those lines, but then when it comes to the radiation, that's where fungi can actually really be interesting. There's this concept called radiotropism, where melanin-rich fungi are actually able to convert ionizing radiation, things like gamma rays, X-rays, all of this radiation that we would expect to, or that we know that we'll find once we get out of the Earth's magnetic shield. It can convert that into benign forms of energy and actually convert that into biomass. So this is something that's, the biggest liability for NASA and others is the radiation, because that's very dangerous to the human traveler. If we can actually use that liability to create materials from, then we're taking this waste resource and flipping it on its head. And you'll see that as a theme of things we're commonly doing with our mycotecture. Fungi are expert at basically converting waste material into new and useful material. And here's one way that we can do that off planet. We can actually take these dangerous forms of energy and convert them into useful items. We've done quite a bit of experimentation around this, and as I mentioned, it's melanin-rich fungi that are particularly suited for this. So we've collected a lot of different species and made different experiments on using melanin-rich fungi, using melanin isolated from fungi, and using synthetic fungi. So this is work we're doing with folks here at NASA Glenn, Johns Hopkins University, and the University of Akron, the top researchers in melanin studies, basically. We converted these into small samples. Those samples were then put into these aluminum cases. These aluminum cases were sent to the International Space Station, and they were put on the outside of the space station. So you can see on the right there's the panels that have the samples. On the left there, that bar that's going vertically is actually the atmosphere of the Earth. So we're way up here. And we're basically pointed these elements towards the sun, away from the sun, and in different configurations, and are noticing the degradation that happens due to that cosmic radiation, due to what they call atomic oxygen. So it's a very volatile element that's singular oxygen, whereas here on the surface of the Earth we have O2, or diatomic oxygen, which is also very bad for certain materials. It's great for us because we breathe it, but oxygen is very reactive. So you can see that some of the damage is from that atomic oxygen, some of it is from the radiation. And I should say that you do see the damage, but some materials that go up there don't come back. They just get completely disintegrated. So this was a pass. Is actually an A+, according to some of our researchers that we're working with on this. So a little bit closer to home, and again, using a waste resource and converting that into something positive, and ideally several positive outcomes, is our work that we're doing in Namibia with MIT and Standard Bank. We've started a company called MycoHab that's converting the encroacher bush, which is choking wildlife resources and absorbing water from aquifers. We're converting that into the substrate for growing mushrooms, edible mushrooms, and then those mushrooms go to market. They're used for food security. They feed people, and then the waste from the mushroom farming is used to make building materials. So it's circular a couple times over. There's a waste resource that's being utilized a couple times over. We take this waste and we make food from it, and then we take the waste from that and we make building materials from that. And there in the middle you see Ivan, who's our site manager, holding one of the blocks. They're about a cubic foot. They're about 10 kilogram. And they're importantly, they store about 43% organic carbon from that bush. So that bush that needed to be extracted is then turned into something that is storing that carbon long term in our buildings. Here's the process in a nutshell. You see the bush, and then they're grown in these large columns. The mushrooms are easily harvested because they grow through the holes in these columns. They're sent to market, and then that waste column is put into a press that we had built in Namibia and pressed into these blocks. And so, there's many ways of working with this. We can use this to create food security for the developing world and housing in the developing world. And then some of the mushrooms can be sent to the developed world, or might I say overdeveloped world in some cases, and sold at high margins so that they can subsidize some of the humanitarian work. And so this is a brand of product that's called humanity. When you put it all together, and the concept here is that by buying this tea, you not only are you boosting your own immune system, but you're providing houses for folks in Africa. The same thing with the mushroom biltong, which is the South African way of saying jerky.
Hey, Chris, I wanted to ask you another question on this.
Sure.
So the tea is made from the mushrooms, and right? Is that correct?
That's correct.
And so, did you have to get over a reticence on the part of these folks to actually start eating mushrooms? Because I don't think mushrooms were a part of their diet, or were they?
Well, in Namibia, actually, yes. So we're growing oyster mushrooms there, and they are selling very well. There are interesting species of wild mushrooms that are very popular there, that are actually cultivated by the ants. It's a really fascinating topic. I'd love to tell you the whole story, but the ants basically bring in the substrate into their tunnels, and they use it as an air conditioning system. And then the mycelium that they're working with actually produces these mushrooms, and then the people harvest the mushrooms. The ants want nothing to do with the mushrooms, but they grow them for the people. It's really amazing. So there is the culture of mushrooms in Namibia. Throughout sub-Saharan Africa, that is not the case necessarily. So that's one of the reasons we're looking at export. And the tea would be made from reishi mushroom, which is not an edible mushroom, but considered medicinal because it has immune boosting properties to it. The biltong would be made from the oyster mushrooms that we're growing and selling in country, but we're finding it's a very small population. So as we scale this up, we need to export more. So we're working with folks at USAID and other places to develop this export capacity. Okay. And then I just want to say that, this is basically the scale that we're working with there. We can do single story buildings with the blocks that we've made. And you'll see that all of these buildings are kind of detailed traditionally, with siding or rendering, or, in some cases, metal, roofing to the project. So traditionally sheathed materials or traditionally sided materials, but the structure itself is made out of this material. So you can actually store a lot of that carbon mass in the building, and then have ideally recyclable materials as the outside. So the Biocyler is the one that wanted to talk to everyone about the most. Those were examples of how we're taking waste resources and converting them into building materials. Some of those are further along in their trajectory in the Biocyler, but what we want to do here is actually convert construction and demolition waste into building materials. And there are over 500 million tons of C&D waste that go into landfills every year, and they tend to rot in the landfills and create greenhouse gases. It's a huge resource that's actually, going to waste, and we believe that it could be recycled using the same process. Some topics to really get into as we look at our Biocyler. This is a concept around environmental justice, and so I should define what the injustice is that we're looking to resolve. The built environment here is not equal. The communities of color have 1.54 higher exposure to air pollution. Black children are disproportionately affected by lead poisoning in the built environment. That's from things like lead paint that's in their environments. According to the Cleveland Clinic, where I am, the city of Cleveland, which is a predominantly Black city, has lead poisoning rates of 4 times the national average. And 3 out of 5 Black Americans live with uncontrolled toxic waste in their communities. And that includes things like the lead that I'm talking about. So when the Cleveland Clinic says, the lead poisoning is bad here, it's worse than it was in Flint, Michigan in 2012 when we were all paying attention to that. It's not the water supply, it is the built environment. Children are being poisoned by the houses that they live in. The infrastructure here is crumbling like many thinning cities in America. And the houses continue to deteriorate and poison the people that are living in them. And then the ones that are sent to demolition, they're basically disposed of in ways that allow that those poisons to get back into the environment through leaching into the water supply. So what we want to do with the Biocyler is actually take this concept, this MIT patented process for mycotecture that we're doing at MycoHab, but instead of using the encroacher bush, we want to use the waste resource we have here in Cleveland, which is crumbling infrastructure, which is old houses that are poisoning people. And instead of making food and building materials, what we want to make now is remediation services and materials. So we're going to take that C&D waste, we're going to use the same biobinders, which is this fungal mycelium that binds together the material, and we're going to create new materials and remediation. So the food is not part of this process. That's something that's very needed in the African context, but here in America, the what we think is more pressing is cleaning the built environment, the remediation of the built environment. So fungi can do this in a couple different ways, and unfortunately, fungi like me don't spell very well, so there's a typo I see. But that should say enzymatic breakdown. So what happens is the fungi actually secrete these enzymes, including things like hydrogen peroxide and different chemicals that actually break down the matter that they convert into their own biomass. And by doing that, they can actually break down things like petrochemicals, because these are basically bio-based as well. They were biological matter millions of years ago, and they've been converted into petrochemicals now. So the fungi actually break those down into safer molecule chains, and they make them safe in their basically into monomers that are now safe in the environment. The other thing they can do is biochelations. When it comes to heavy metals, you can't break them down any further. They become dangerous at the elemental level. So what you do is exactly the opposite. Instead of breaking them down into smaller chains, you build them up into bigger chains that are then biologically unavailable. So this is this concept biochelation. And interestingly enough, one of the mechanisms we're looking at using here is the same as what we're using in space, and it's melanin. So melanin is a key natural biochelator. Other things we're considering and testing right now are biochar and other methods of actually chelating that material. And here is some microscopy of actually how that works. So not only do they become chelated onto other chemicals, they can be lodged within the cell wall of the mycelium. and that is very chitin rich. And there's a reason you have to cook certain mushrooms to be able to digest them, is because chitin is very undigestible otherwise. So if this was an uncooked piece of building material, it would not allow that lead to get into a child's blood supply. Here are some images from experiments that we've done. So we've put them through what's called the toxic characteristic leaching procedure, and we've actually tested them for their end of life. So I mentioned, C&D waste going to landfills and leaching into the water supply. We've done these experiments to show that even at the end of their life, when they go through that leaching process, they don't allow those heavy metals to become in the environment anymore. So it safely encapsulates them for potentially hundreds of years. And that's what we're trying to get to the bottom of, exactly how long that is, to make this a scientifically proven methodology. And again, right now we're at the point where we could make these materials very similar to what we're doing in Namibia and build one-story structures with them. We want to get to the point where we can actually scale this up and do these into large panels that would compete with technologies such as cross-laminated timber. And then that's where the carbon sequestration starts to really make sense, where we can really store a lot of carbon in doing this. CLT is very good at storing carbon, but it also causes deforestation. We want to kind of go along the same methods of carbon storage, but using circular resources. The way we want to prove this, we're working with folks that are doing blockchain technology to actually prove carbon capture. As many of you probably know, a lot of the carbon credits and carbon offsets are total BS. I think 90% of carbon offsets were reported as false recently. So we want to do this in a very transparent way that you can actually prove that the carbon we say is being stored is being stored. It can also give you access to people who are working on the project and talk about what material inputs went through there. Some images of the facility we're hoping to build within the next couple of years to kind of scale this up. And my contact information there, if anyone wants to take that down, and I'd love to pass the baton at this point.
Wow, that's the only thing I can say, Chris, is wow, really.
Thanks.
I'd like to be able to have us spend a lot of time going into greater detail and understanding, but I think we'll have to save some of that for another day. But I want to salute the work you're doing. It's extraordinary, just extraordinary. And maybe we'll have a chance to cycle back after we have a chance to talk to Michael at the end for a little bit. If you're able to stay with us, I hope.
I think Chris has got to depart at 12 noon, as we talked about. Yeah.
Yeah. So, Michael, how are you?
Good. Can you see me?
Yes, we can.
Great. Nice to see you all.
So Tom introduced you before in terms of some of the systems you've been developing. I don't know quite how to segue from Chris's technology experiments, but tell us, please, more about what you do and how it might even be used in the areas that Chris is developing.
Sure. Michael Sussman. I had significant success early in my career that started in my business career that started getting me used to thinking and acting at the level of whole national commercial systems. I owned founded and owned the largest manufacturer and installer of refrigeration for flower shops and in the country. And the times, this was in the 1980s, if you all remember, when Ronald Reagan came into office, he started talking about the end of global war as the primary way of international relations, and that it would be really useful to shift into global business and international business as the primary way that we would relate with each other. And I thought, well, given that business is conducted almost exclusively as commercial warfare amongst individual competing entities, that was not going to be an avenue that would lead us to global peace and sustainability, and that we really needed to transform the fundamental principles that we apply to business. And when we think about what business is, it's the production, at its most important to humanity, it's the extraction or growing of food, it's the building of material, the development of materials for building structures, as Chris's presentation, covered the direction that we need to move in, and how we use the Earth's materials to provide life for human beings is really among the most important functions we have as human beings. And if the principles that we're applying to business and therefore industrial systems are that flawed and narrowly focused on individual gain for individual businesses, I took it as my life's work to get out ahead of that and bring forward, as Buckminster Fuller said, a new model that we could introduce industrial leaders to step out of the now centuries and centuries of competition for individual gain to actual collaboration and coordination and trust for the good of the community and the good of the whole system. So that was the mid-1990s. And I saw that I needed to have a particular industrial arena, or as I call it, an entire arena of industrial activity and related public policy, because as we know, business and industry is very much also a function of the political and governing and regulatory protocols that we establish for how business is going to be conducted. So I knew I needed to choose a particular arena to bring this model forward. And when I was introduced to a freight railroad and learned, I solved their finance challenge. It was 1995, and the railroad was the Massachusetts Central. And I found out that railroads, which were like the reason that capital flowed into North America from around the world when we were building our industrial systems in the 19th century, that at the end of the 20th century was declining, and what it was passed by was the trucking industry and the highway industry. And I thought, wait a minute, this method of moving freight and people over land that's so efficient and so utilizes the fundamental physics of the earth, energy, gravity, friction, power, is underutilized for moving goods and people over land. You should, really everyone should know that in North America, and this is not just North America, it's around the world, but in North America, the trucking industry is 10 times larger than the railroad industry. So we're using rubber tires on hard asphalt and concrete, which creates tremendous amount of friction and drag, therefore uses so much more fuel, energy, produces so much more emissions. we're using that 10 times more than a hard steel wheel on a hard steel rail. And when I first learned that, I thought, well, what does that say about capitalism, competition, and really how we're organizing ourselves as a civilization? And that if we turn that around, literally we have our hands on the wheel of civilization, because moving goods, food, energy, building materials over land is as fundamental an element of a well-working society as there is. And getting that right can deliver cascading benefits to not only the transportation system, but the environment, the quality of community life, safety. And so I embarked on bringing a new model forward in the North American freight railroad industry, became the most active orchestrator of infrastructure projects. Well, let me just say one of the most active over the last 3 decades. And I also chose the railroad industry because railroads connect to agriculture, manufacturing, food, all government, history. And I knew that creating an identity within the railroad industry would give me a platform for speaking to all the industrial systems that we're currently applying at how we're organized as a society and a civilization. So that turned out to be very effective. And along the way, I have made it a point to learn from individual after individual after individual. And I'm now up to having interviewed 11,000 individuals from all walks of life across all 50 states. So in my work, I get to relate to people in rural America, urban America, Democrats, Republicans, workers, staff, labor, management, executives, financiers, the whole ball of wax. And so I want to pause my comments here because I would just as soon interact in dialogue and speak any further, in relation with the conversation. So I'm not sure how this works, but whoever wants to ask a question, or we can refer to the chat, or.
Yeah, thank you, Michael. It's great to have that background in some of the some of your work that you and I've talked about. It would be helpful to just talk about intangible human interaction. How does your work and the way you approach getting to systems thinking, getting to solutions, getting to different stakeholders and people? What's the technology and what are the results and how do you go about that?
Sure. So what I found really early on and ever since is that we are not short of intelligence. There are so many intelligent individuals across the world, in all walks of life, in all agencies, in all committees, in all companies, in all communities, but we're woefully short of the forums, the methodologies, the approaches to enable people to think together, to create effective plans, effective projects, effective approaches, effective solutions. We have courts, we have town hall meetings, we have conferences, and I've spoken to so many conferences, and what I've observed is that they're exciting when you're there. Of course, you've gathered a lot of people that are all involved in one arena, but the whole way that they're structured leads to so little actual thinking together and problem solving in any way that's cataloged or organized so that folks can continue to interact productively around the thinking that they started at the conference or at the meeting. So we started interacting with a way to speak and listen and collate and catalog the speaking and organize it while the dialogue is going on. So instead of what happens now, and this is ubiquitous, this is across human relations, what we see in just about every meeting, every gathering, every discussion, every phone call, Zoom call, what we see is that when you have engaged people, of course, there's a lot of talking because smart people have a lot of things to say. And we hope that someone's just taking notes and organizing those notes in some decent fashion and hopefully sharing the notes after the meeting. Except then when you go to look at the notes, what are they? They're notes of a indiscriminate set of interactions of people talking, responding, reacting. And we found that by organizing the dialogue as it's happening, slowing everybody down, thinking and writing the questions that we're actually out to talk about, that folks immediately, one, it's a method that no one needs a whole lecture about. They don't need a course or a workshop. People can get just by looking at the screen. Like do I have access to share my screen?
You should have.
So
Yes.
I only started this just a few minutes ago while Chris was speaking. What do we want to accomplish from our dialogue with Michael Sussman at Humanity Rising? So I thought, well, begin to establish the foundation for productive collaboration. And then I would go, well, let's see, we'd want to share with Michael what Humanity Rising is committed to. Have Michael share what Intellisynthesis is. So let me take that off for a second and share what Intellisynthesis is. So after seeing that the finance community that had really blossomed in North America from the 19th into the early 20th century, when railroads was the primary driver to industrial systems, that at the end of the 20th century, there was a huge gap between banks, investors, and railroads, as if they don't understand each other. I determined to go to Washington and see, well, what was Washington thinking about railroads, freight transportation, the importance of it, the relevance of it? How are they organized to support efficient logistics, supply chain movements? And I started going to Washington and finding out that, again, there's so much intelligence, and yet it's as if we've thrown a wet blanket over all of our intelligence. Instead of actually working on problems, that the methods that we bring to bear, where we even start from, we start from a place as if the problems are ongoing and insurmountable. So we don't even articulate where we want to get to. We don't even have in the way of being with each other that we're here to solve this problem. today in this conversation. We're actually out here to advance, to be in action. So I started noticing that throughout this industrial arena and governing issue, when I'd have one-on-one conversations with people, I'd get truths about the industry communicated to me by person after person after person. And yet, what was being talked about publicly in the industry didn't cover any of those things that people knew the realities were, the dynamics were. They knew how the power influencers were impacting and squashing the intelligence. So I just kept going around and bringing people together around projects where they felt safe to work on the project because they felt like there was a real vision and a possibility. And so we started developing an understanding of Intellisynthesis. And I'll share it with you, and I want to pause and give you a chance to respond. Intellisynthesis is the logic and intelligence that's all around us, but so often hidden from view. And what's it hidden from view by? Politics, posturing, positioning. When you bring people together where you don't have politics, posturing, and positioning, and I'll say the primary door opener to this kind of intelligence is when we come to that dialogue committed to that our interaction is going to be driving toward the absolute highest value that we can bring to our community. Most everyone that's interacting in business and government and politics comes to every meeting that they're involved in with such a strong agenda that tends to be their agenda, tends to be what they want to accomplish or what they're paid to do or what their company is rewarded for, that the dialogue just gets watered down to where everybody is at their dumbest.
Hey, Michael,
Yeah,
I really like what you're saying, but from a practical perspective, I have a question.
yes.
So if we go into this gathering in each of the sides, and we know that we're here for the highest and best outcome of the community, from a practical perspective, what that is could be different to each party. And so therein, I think, lies the problem, right?
Not a problem. That's so interesting because, as you know, language matters. It's not a problem. All the perspectives, concerns, all the agendas are what makes collective intelligence. Facilitating everyone's input just lets everybody's the intelligence of the thinking, the intelligence of the questions, all enables us to now bring forward solutions that are multifaceted, multidimensional, because that's what we need our solutions to be. And what we find is that when we practice Intellisynthesis, just everybody's issue or concern gets put on the table as a contribution to the thinking. It's not a problem. As a matter of fact, we're like a laser. Tell me your agenda. Tell me your problem. Tell me how what you get and don't get out of the current approach, and what your concern is about any new approach that we could be considering. And you actually get that out on the table and get it cataloged. There's more I could say about this, but I just as soon answer another question.
Well, actually,
Or you, Russell, what are you feeling about that?
George was just saying something, Michael. Go ahead.
Go ahead.
No, well, 2 points. One, before we get so far away from the first part of your conversation, obviously, we noted during the pandemic and since the trucking continues to be the primary form of moving goods and services in the US, which is to our detriment, clearly. Not only does it terribly impact the supply chain issues and all the rest of it, but it's all of the things that you indicated. So how do we get, Michael, from the intelligent system of moving goods and services or back to it from the lunatic system that we currently have?
Yeah.
That's one question I have.
Yes.
The second question, which leads to the Intellisystems strategy that you're talking about,
Yeah.
is we have a lot to talk about. And we have a lot to talk about, we being Humanity Rising Network as it evolves, is because one of the things that we are going to do is focus on solution-based dialogue. In many ways, what your system does is it reinvents the dialogue concept of Plato and arriving at truth through greater understanding and reason that is inclusive, but its purpose is not simply to fragment, which is what most conversation today is
Debate.
not dialogue, but discussion.
Yes.
And discussion and debate just fractures things,
Yes.
right? So you're evolving a system to bring back the integration of content to lead to greater understanding. And that's one of our goals on Humanity Rising. So we have a lot to talk about with that.
Great.
But answer my question about railroads versus
Yes.
where are we?
This is what this looks like in action. This is the North American Freight Forum. I have founded this with my co-founders, Daniel Elliott, the former chair of the United States Surface Transportation Board, Jim Hecker, former chair of the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, and Ren Robbins, former head of NASA's, the FAA's $18 billion next gen air traffic control system. And what this is what this is Intellisynthesis in action. And what we're engaged in now are a set of the most important dialogues that need to be had in North American supply chain and transportation and logistics. So we start, rail trucking coordination in teleconference, and the rail regulatory excellence in teleconference. Any of you that read the news know that rail regulations have been a raging issue since the East Palestine accident. So take this one, the container logistics. Well, I tell you what, let's go down for demonstration purposes. Rail management, rail labor. If you also follow the news, you know that that's an issue. So here is the Intelliconference or Intellisynthesis methodology, names the Intelliconference. And Intelliconference is the event. You think of the Intelliconference as like a ballpark, and Intellisynthesis is baseball. You engage in Intellisynthesis within an Intelliconference. And rail management and rail labor have been at odds for the entire life. So you name the core question. What's the question that heads everybody toward an open-minded but positive outcome? And then you start with the dialogue questions. And of course, as we all know, in good gathering of dialogues, once we identify what stakeholders would engage in this dialogue, you'd have them input into, well, are these the right questions we should be asking? What other questions should we be asking? And then we have a whole, platform that we have built and are continuing to build for allowing people to respond to questions remote from wherever they are. This is not, doesn't have to be live. It's asynchronous. And so that's rail labor, but you asked specifically about trucking. So the rail trucking coordination and teleconference is here. You know, how can trucking and railroad, first of all, what commercial and public policy improvements would optimize the interconnectivity of trucking and railroading to the benefit of management, labor, communities, and the natural environment? And then we start to list the fundamental questions that have to be asked. And so like that. So before I go on too much longer, George, I just wanted to.
So that's the process you're using.
Yeah.
What impact is it beginning to have?
So are most of you familiar with that there was a horrific hazardous waste rail accident
Yes.
that happened? And since that happened, we gathered our team and expanded the rail regulatory excellence in teleconference. Now, what happens when there's ever any kind of a horrific accident is that a United States senator or a congressman takes it upon themselves to quickly throw together a piece of legislation which hammers down on one element of an industry without really engaging with that industry to really understand what's truly happening, what caused that accident. And we have a whole history of that. There was a horrific accident in California in 2009. And before you know it, the railroad industry got mandated to install a satellite traffic control system, a GPS satellite traffic control system, to keep locomotives from crashing into each other. So here what we did was gathered stakeholders and started teasing out a rail regulatory excellence in teleconference. And this is now the most thoughtful body of questions that should be asked and answered to bring forward a new improved regulatory regime to oversee the safety of railroad transportation. You know, Intellisynthesis, then by the nature of it, because as I said, it's the logic and intelligence that's all around us. So some of that's in nature, some of it is in the staff person that's in the next office, some of it is in the business owner that's down the street. Some of it is just logic and intelligence. So you look at this and you think, well, what's the big deal? It's just a smart list. Couldn't you gotten some professor to do this? Couldn't you gotten some, regulator to do this? Except, no, it doesn't happen. This kind of thinking doesn't happen. There's reports and studies and opinion pieces and social media and rules and regulations, but actually thinking through, utilizing inquiry-based dialogue doesn't happen, and it doesn't get engaged in. And so to be clear, this is not yet what Joe Biden, President Biden, is attending to in the investments and regulations that his administration is propagating. But I'm in dialogue with the head of the Federal Railroad Administration. I've met with him 3 times in the last 3 months since the East Palestine accident. He's terrifically excited about this. And we're in the process of, relating to the government and toward having them embrace this. And just yesterday, I enrolled an actual member of the Biden Trucking Task Force, which, by the way, there is. And he's going to sit on our senior advisory team. So go ahead, George. What do you think?
No, I think it's a wonderful system. I do. I applaud it. It's incredibly necessary. And you're now discussing the critical factor, and that is, how is it accepted and where can it be accepted in order to bring about changes in the way we do things. So I applaud it. I think it's terrific. Tom, where are you with this?
Yeah, I mean, Michael, in the conversations we've had over the course of the year, what I've appreciated about how you've approached this is it's getting beyond just a multi-stakeholder way of thinking. It's getting the points of view, opinion, and it is a dialogue process. It's not a consensus process. It's about getting to the best result and being able to take into consideration all of the elements that are or can be harvested from all the points of view. And it is when we think about technologies of hope, it's a very hopeful way of solving problems.
I just yesterday got an email from Zoom saying that they were instituting a new feature where the chat function could remain live after the event. And I'm doing my best to kind of peek over at the chat. People are asking good questions and introducing themselves. I'm sure you're not already set up for that. How do we want to deal with that so that we can capture? Mary, could you do me a favor and either screenshot or cut and paste from folks, or let me put in I'll put in the easiest place if people would want to go to the homepage of ontracknorthamerica.org and just scroll down to the bottom of the homepage. There's a place to register or sign up for the mailing list. And then I think there's some folks asking, is there time? Folks I did notice asking for an example of this other than what I'm showing in the North American Freight Forum. Is there a few more minutes left that I should do?
I was going to invite Jim to come back and join us.
Go ahead.
If you want,
Go ahead.
if you want to go ahead and share another example.
So maybe I should just speak to this. So you all know that there are that we have a problem with forest fires. I'm in Philadelphia. We're experiencing smoky air coming from Canadian forest fires. Because the system that we've developed doesn't just apply to transportation, we dove into the national problem that we have that is not being solved by the federal government or any of the other government entities. And that is the disconnect. Our forests are tremendously mismanaged right now. They're overburdened, they're overly dense, they're a recipe for forest fires, and there's value in those forests. There's material that can be brought out that makes the forest healthier, the watersheds healthier, and produces value for local communities to log the material and harvest and process the material and turn it into wood products. But the parties don't have any way to connect, communicate, coordinate. There's no plan, there's no system. Even while the federal government is spending billions of dollars, literally, in the aftermath of each of these large forest fires. So we started interacting in New Mexico in the aftermath of a $500,000 acre forest fire that happened last spring, and interviewing all the stakeholders, cataloging them in our database system, which is also a unique part of this. And we built a dialogue agenda for creating a new business model that relates all the landowners with all the mill owners and loggers into an effective new business model for scaling up harvesting, logistics, and processing of material from forests. And people love it. And just extremely smart thinking. So that's it. Go ahead.
Well, thank you, Michael. very much. And I don't know whether, is Chris still with us or did he have to go, Russ?
He had to leave, I think.
Oh, he had to leave. Because I just wanted to say, I thought his presentation was extraordinary. And I think the question I'd love to have you respond to, Michael, is this disconnect between reality and possibility. I mean, Chris was saying that where he lives in Cincinnati, you know, all these, particularly Black kids and the Black population there is suffering from all kinds of lead and heavy metal diseases, even worse than Flint, Michigan. And yet he was showing us all these remedies made out of mushrooms and all kinds of things. And you're coming in and saying, well, you know, when you show up, you looked at the trucking industry and the rail industry, and it was just completely cockamamie and wrong-headed. And we encountered this time and time again on Humanity Rising of people of extraordinary intelligence and creativity that are coming in, recognizing that the prevailing system is almost designed for failure, and in fact is failing. And the solutions, whether it's in Intellisynthesis or elsewhere, are kind of staring us in the face, but we don't seem to be able to bridge this gap between the prevailing institutions and mentality and the kind of solutions that are so obvious. How do you understand that disconnect? Because you've had some very deep experience at so many different levels of the polity. How do you understand that?
I'm really glad you asked that. Because I wanted to understand how did we get to where railroads would be underfunded after being the rationale that capital flowed from around the world into North America, I started studying the whole history of the United States, from its indigenous peoples through the pre-Revolutionary War, all through the Industrial Revolution, to understand where did it go? What happened? How did we end up with these disconnects? And I believe I put my finger on the fundamental, most important dynamic in human history. And two things happened concurrently. One, we had this whole continent of almost unlimited natural resources. And it was supposed to be it was set up with the place where we were now going to get it right. We were now going to set up a society that was going to bring the best of European, only, and not necessarily indigenous people's wisdom. But, you know, it was, things were going pretty well here. And at the same time, Charles Darwin wrote Origin of Species. And there was a moment that what happened was we didn't have books here. We didn't have Barnes and Noble. We didn't have Netflix. There was just a book over there, and industrialists here, a very few number of men who had grabbed a hold of huge amounts of land, resources, money, you know, larger gap in wealth than we even have now. And they needed cover. At the same time, we were deciding, are we going to be communist? Are we going to be socialist? Are we going to be democratic? And what happened was the industrialists here wanted to keep the people believing that if we just all competed with each other, that's the best way. Well, of course, they were already at the top of the mountain looking down at everybody else. Yeah, you all compete. Charles Darwin didn't say that individuals competed in nature. He said, because I went and I have 15 books on Charles Darwin within 10 feet of me, because I wanted to know, what did he actually say? And he said that when he went around to the rookeries and hatcheries and tide pools, what he saw overwhelmingly was the communities identified who was best and strongest and most able to contribute to future generations, and gave those individuals the best perches, the best food, the best support. It wasn't those stronger birds punching down at the others. But those industrialists wanted, so they actually funded the
Totally.
social philosophers to come to the United States and give talks about what they wanted him to say, Charles Darwin said. And as a civilization, we embraced competition for narrow gain as the fundamental driving, orienting principle. And we put that into governance, politics, industry, business. So as I say in Nevada, where I spent 2 years writing a whole state plan, we need to be committed to building in Nevada what should be in Nevada, and build in Utah what should be in Utah. And when you get on the, so I'll pause there. And they embraced it for a while until the gold mining industry said we didn't like Michael talking about how gold mining takes up so much water. Yes.
Well, we've had, many people on many sessions on Humanity Rising on this more faithful interpretation of Darwin, the whole pro-social movement that I'm sure you're familiar with is really articulating the deeper realities of evolution as a collaborative venture as opposed to a competitive venture. And I think you're absolutely right that one of the seed kernels of the distortion that happened in US, and I would say Western European and world history, is the way the industrialists focused on the survival of the fittest and the competitive model and universalized it. And I think that the consequences of that have been extremely corrosive on human well-being. And I really want to appreciate, as George did, your Intellisynthesis, because I think it's only when you bring the stakeholders together, whoever they are and whatever their positions are, that you begin to unfold a process of a collective discernment that will bring the goodness out of everyone. It's interesting that isolation and competitiveness brings the shadow content out, but true dialogue and collaborative design structures bring the goodness out. And I think you've really tapped into that in a very, very powerful way, it seems to me, across a range of fields. So you're bringing sort of a Renaissance intelligence to what it is that you're doing. It's completely fascinating. I'd love to learn a lot more.
That's great. I think we're coming toward the close, right?
Yeah. So Russ or George, Tom, any final words, and we can say a word about tomorrow?
Well, I think, Michael, we have a lot to talk about. This is the beginning
Clearly.
of a very long conversation.
Very good.
And a very good one. And although, Chris, you can't hear us, just remarkable work that deserves and requires greater exposure. And we'll have a way to come bring you back to talk about more of that, because there are a lot of questions that were not answered that are in the chat, a lot of comments. Tomorrow, another terrific day. We're going to look at autism from a couple of different perspectives. Just as we began the program, or at least as I did, let's remember Drucker, that if we want to know the future, let's invent it. We have the capacity to invent it. We have the capacity just to discover what's already been invented and hasn't been well utilized. Russ, thank you for your contributions. Tom, Russ, anything you want to close on?
I look forward to tomorrow. Thank you.
Yeah, it's been a terrific week, and I love the range of topics that we've been talking about in the realm of technologies of hope. Much to be encouraged by.
Hey, thanks,
Thank
everyone.
you, gentlemen. Thank you, Michael. I just
Yeah.
noticed you put in the chat your practice of radical inclusion. We talk about radical collaboration on Humanity Rising, but it's clearly a moment of radical unreasonableness, as George put it in an earlier
Yes.
conversation.
Yes.
So I really want to thank you. And that'll bring us to a close, everyone. You're all welcome to the after session chat. You'll see the link in the chat box. And then we'll see you again for our session tomorrow on autism. It's an extraordinary thing that 50 years ago, 1 in 10,000 were autistic. And now it's about 1 in 40. And so we're dealing with an issue that is escalating in its impact, and how technologies of hope are emanating around that situation is of very much importance to all of us. Thank you, everyone. See you tomorrow.
Thank you.
Great.
Bye-bye.